Thank you, Larry. Appreciate it very much. Jonathan has probably spent as much time with the prospective candidates as anybody. Jonathan, what's your take on what we're going to see next year?
Well, first, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here on the same stage with two of the top strategists in the business, and Ron, who is, of course, the North Star for a lot of journalists like myself. I won't take up too much time because I want to go into questions, but let me just talk for a bit about the primary. I was in Iowa this week. I was there Monday at the Faith and Freedom Coalition cattle call, for lack of a better phrase, and saw the candidates, and then spent the next day driving out to western Iowa with Senator Santorum. I think the key question looming over the Republican primary is, which Republican Party is this? Is this the GOP that we've known for the last 40 years, that is a party that practices political primogeniture, which is sort of the first son gets the castle, where the next guy in line always gets the party's nomination, and the establishment ultimately wins out over the sort of grassroots and the populists? Or is this the Republican Party that we saw in 2010, where, yes, thank you, Mike Castle, for your years of service. You are a valued public servant and a serious person. You were governor of our fine state and in the House for 15 years, but you know what? No, thank you. You're too moderate. We're going to put in this new person, Christine O'Donnell, who is much more in line with where we are as a party. So which party is it? Is it the party that we've known for decades, or is it the party of 2010, where not just the Tea Party, but the sort of energy, the populist energy of the Tea Party movement has a firm hold? I think that question has yet to be determined, but I think that is key. If it's the old rules, and I think Romney does have a slight advantage, it's going to be interesting to see, though, how he can navigate a primary calendar that includes Iowa and South Carolina out of the chute. A lot of the attention goes to Romney's Iowa issue. I would argue that there should be as much coverage about what Romney does about South Carolina. Since 1980, when Reagan won the primary, no Republican has gotten the nomination without winning South Carolina. It is the firewall for a reason. It's where the establishment typically wins out. I would include McCain in that category, who I think in 2008, at that point, was the closest thing that there was to an establishment candidate, where Romney was not really in the picture, and it was more of a Huckabee v. McCain race. McCain was more the establishment guy. What does Romney do about South Carolina? We know he's probably going to play in Iowa. He will not be there as much as he was last time. He's not going to be living out of Winnebago before the straw poll for 2 weeks, but he will obviously have a presence there. They'll try and lower expectations so he can come in a gentleman's second or third, I would imagine, and still come away okay with the assumption that he wins New Hampshire afterwards. But what does he do about South Carolina? It's one thing to lose one state. We've seen that happen before. Bush 2000, Obama 08. You can take a hit early and still win. I think it's tougher for Republicans to lose out of the gate in Iowa and then go to the first Southern primary and lose and still get the nomination. So I think he has to figure that out. And again, it gets to that question of which party is this that we're talking about. I see Romney having 3 different challenges in 3 of the first early states. I think he probably has a plenty issue in Iowa. I think in New Hampshire, it's still TBD who's going to be his top rival there. It could be Huntsman, although that's still very much an unsure thing. And then South Carolina, probably going to be a Haley Barbour issue. So you can see Romney sort of try to fend off 3 different or 4 different people right out of the gate, which I think is going to be fascinating to watch. If not Romney, who? If the Tea Party argument that I make does take hold, who? Now, Ron wrote a very smart piece a while back about managers versus populists, which I think has a lot of sense to it. And Romney obviously is the obvious manager. The 2 obvious populists are Huckabee and Palin. Well, what happens if the 2 populists that we're talking about don't get in the race? Who then takes that populist sort of slot? It's often described as the Tea Party slot, but I think Ron's characterization is better. I think it's a populist slot. If you look at polling, and those who make less than 100K or less than 75K, Romney's support really slips. There's a reason why Tim Pawlenty talks so much about his blue-collar upbringing in South St. Paul. There's a reason why Tim Pawlenty talks about playing hockey so much. And it's not just because that's the tradition in American politics. He's making a play for that downscale voter slot if Palin and Huckabee are not in that space. So I think he's making a play for it, but I think that's really something to watch. Who takes that position as the sort of Huckabee of this time around? The more lunch pail Republican. I think that will be very important. Looking at the general election, I just did a story a couple weeks ago about how a lot of Republicans now think, after this euphoria last November, that actually, hey, President Obama is not going to be a pushover. This actually could be not just a tough race, but a race that's going to be hard for us to win. That's the sentiment you talk to a lot of Republicans, not just in Washington, but around the country, who feel that way. Since 1896, the only president who has not won re-election after taking over for the opposite party is Jimmy Carter. So not only is it tough to beat an incumbent, it's especially tough to beat an incumbent after that incumbent takes over for a party that typically the public views as sort of spent. So it's not going to be easy. Of course, it hugely depends upon the economy. But this is going to be a real challenge for Republicans. Ron, I'm sure we'll talk at length about this, so I'll just touch on it. But looking at the map right now, I had Tom Cole said to me, I think this was very smart, what could make 2012 different than most recent presidential re-elects is you could see the incumbent president win, but win by a narrower margin than he won the first time around. Because typically it's the opposite, right? Look at 84, 96, and 04. The incumbent president won re-election, but with a much broader, not much, but a broader margin than he won the White House with in the first place. This could be different. I think I'd be curious for Larry's view, but I think Indiana is going to be a heck of a lot tougher to hold. I think Ohio is going to be tougher to hold. There's a lot of strong feelings in the White House about my home state, the Commonwealth of Virginia and North Carolina. They really think that they're going to be able to hold those states and that they were not anomalies from 2008. There's a reason why that convention is going to be in Charlotte, not St. Louis. Ron and I have talked about this. I think it's going to be difficult. I would not place them in the same bucket as Indiana. I think they're easier than that's going to be, but still going to be a challenge to hold those two states. I think both of them are changing states demographically, but they, I think, are still changing. They have not become the sort of classic purple states yet, and I think the onus is still on Democrats. Just look at what happened in 2009 and 2010 in Virginia, especially somebody like Jerry Connolly, who represents that old Tom Davis district. It's Prince William, it's Fairfax. It is very much an upscale professional district. It's the place where really President Obama won Virginia. If you look at how he won the state, look at his margin in Fairfax County. What happened there? Well, Jerry Connolly, the incumbent House Democrat, came within a few hundred votes of losing his reelection to, frankly, a second-tier Republican opponent. So I think that, combined with the 2009 statewide results in Virginia, shows that it's still a reddish-purple state. I think if you look at Carolina, Bev Purdue's going to have a hard time in her reelect. And Burr, there was some buzz about Burr having a challenge. Burr never had a race. Burr won easily, and for the first time, I think since Reconstruction, the GOP took over the State House in North Carolina. I know that the presidential cycles are different than off-year cycles. You will have a different kind of electorate come out in 12 than you did 10, but I think those states are going to be contested, but still, I think perhaps lean a tad bit to Republicans out of the gate. With that, I will stop, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about the Mountain West and other parts of the country from Ron.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Appreciate it. Ron, you've got as good a sense of political history as anybody writing today. How do you place this in the context of what you've seen?
Thanks, Whit. Thanks, everybody. Well, let me start with the Republican race, and I think you can say empirically, statistically, this is the most wide-open Republican race since at least 1940. Gallup the other day noted that at this point, modern polling goes back to 1952 for presidential primaries. At this point, in every previous Republican race, there was one candidate with at least 30% support. Today, there is no candidate in Gallup with 20% support, and two of the three who are at the top, as Jonathan mentioned, Huckabee and Sarah Palin, might not even run. If you consider that Dewey was a front runner in 44 and 48 and then won, you'd probably have to go back to 1940, I think, to find a race that was this unformed, this close, to the first vote. I noted today in my column, if you consider that, if you had Dewey, Vandenberg, and Taft in that race, you could argue that even that field had more stature within the party than the field that is there today. Now, why is it so informed? I mean, partially it's because the candidates are not out there campaigning, but I would argue to you there are two deeper forces worth keeping in mind about why the Republican race has not coalesced. One is that this kind of instability is what you get when you have a front runner that many people doubt can go all the way. It reminds me to some extent of what we saw in 1987 with Gary Hart before the Donna Rice scandal, when he was the front runner in the field. In fact, was at 45% in Gallup at this point compared to Romney's 17. But still, there was a widespread sense in the Democratic Party that he could not get there in the end. I think you have many Republicans who would agree that Romney is the nominal frontrunner, but believe that he has problems with the kind of the upscale, more economic conservatives over health care, which could be a much bigger issue this time than last time because of the intervening event of Obama passing his plan, and has all sorts of problems with blue-collar, more culturally conservative Republicans, especially evangelicals, who have in the past expressed skepticism, trying to be polite here, about Mormonism. Now, the second reason, though, of which that is kind of a subset, the second reason is that I believe no one has yet shown they can master the changing demography of the Republican Party. I believe that one of the fundamental forces we are living through over the last 50 years in American politics is the class inversion, where if you go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, every Democratic presidential candidate ran significantly better among white voters without a college education than white voters with a college education. They were the party of people who work with their hands. Republicans were the party of people in the corner office. That began to change in the 60s, and as we've talked about before, I don't have to get into here, Democrats, the lines evened under Clinton and have crossed now. Democrats now run better. Every Democratic presidential nominee since Gore has run better among white voters with a college education than white voters without a college education. And John McCain, even while getting wiped out, won almost 60% of working class whites. The effect of that has been to change the nature of the Republican coalition and the nature of its primary electorate. If you look at the cumulative exit poll that was done last time by ABC after the fact, voters without a college education were as big a portion, exactly half of the Republican primary electorate, and exactly half were voters with a college education. Well, as Jonathan was alluding to, in the early poll, and this has been a central divide in Democratic primary politics going back to 1968. There's almost always an upscale wine track candidate, a downscale, what we call beer track candidate. This has not traditionally been an important divide in the Republican Party, but I believe we are reaching the point where it will be. And in fact, if you look at early polling, as Jonathan alluded to, Mitt Romney is much stronger among college-educated and upscale Republicans than he is among non-college and less affluent Republicans. And with Palin and Huckabee, it's the reverse. No one yet has appeal across this divide, and I would argue to you they are looking for different things. The white-collar Republican group is looking for a manager for the economy. I think the blue-collar Republican group is looking for someone who is both more culturally conservative and also in a more populist, tear-down-the-temple mode toward Washington. And I do not know, it is not clear to me yet who is going to be able to transcend this divide. The people who kind of most intrinsically would seem to have the opportunity would be people like Haley Barbour and Tim Pawlenty, but they kind of have a stature issue. So not clear exactly how that plays out, and I think it will matter, by the way, how each pool is fragmented. I mean, if you end up with the finalists in the race being Mitt Romney, Mitch Daniels, and a populist, the advantage will go to the populist because their side of the pool has less competition. If it's Huckabee, Palin, and Romney, I would like Romney's odds. Just to put, before I go to the general election real quick, to put an underline on Jonathan's point, I would go a little further. If you go back to 1980, we've had the same pattern in every contested Republican presidential race. One candidate wins Iowa, a different candidate wins New Hampshire. And by the way, part of the reason for that is that Iowa is 60% evangelical and New Hampshire is 25%. Iowa is the kind of social conservative, more downscale part of the coalition. New Hampshire very much is the upscale part of the coalition. Those two states have split. One of those two wins South Carolina, and that person wins the nominee. That's what's happened every time. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to happen forever, but it does suggest there's a certain strength in that pattern. And I would be surprised, actually, if the winner of South Carolina was not the nominee.